The conference room fell silent as I walked to the podium, every pair of eyes in the Pentagon's most secure briefing facility fixed on me. 24 hours earlier, these same people had been calling me a fraud, a liar, someone who had fabricated her entire military record. Now they sat in stunned silence as the Secretary of Defense himself introduced me as the architect of the operation that had just prevented a catastrophic national security breach. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I could see Colonel Henderson in the third row, the same man who had publicly stripped me of my clearance and escorted me from the base just 6 months ago. His face was ashen, his hands gripping the armrest of his chair so tightly his knuckles had turned white. Next to him sat Major Williams, who had laughed when I tried to explain my classified assignments, telling me that kitchen duty didn't count as intelligence work. But it was the woman in the front row who held my attention, Dr. Patricia Morse, the civilian contractor who had started this whole nightmare by questioning my credentials during a routine security review. She had built her reputation by exposing fraudulent military records, and she had set her sights on me with the determination of a hunter who had found the perfect trophy. As I looked at her now, watching her shrink back in her seat as if trying to disappear, I remembered the moment this all began. It was in a sterile government office, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, when she had smiled that cold, calculating smile and told me that my story simply didn't add up. The review was supposed to be routine. Every 5 years, personnel with high-level security clearances undergo extensive background checks, and after 8 years of impeccable service, I had no reason to worry. I had served in 3 different capacities, worked on classified projects that I couldn't even name to my own family, and had commendations from officers whose names would never appear in any public record. My name is Sergeant First Class Elena Vasquez, and I had dedicated my entire adult life to serving my country in ways that most people would never know existed. I had joined the Army straight out of high school, not because I had nowhere else to go, but because I had grown up listening to my grandfather's stories about World War II and felt a calling that I couldn't ignore. What I didn't expect was how difficult it would be to prove that calling was real. The trouble started during what should have been a straightforward interview with Dr. Morse. She was a contractor brought in specifically to verify military records and ensure that no one was inflating their service history for personal gain. It was an important job, and I respected the need for it. Too many people had been caught lying about their military service, claiming medals they hadn't earned or deployments that never happened. Dr. Morse had my files spread out across her desk, a thick manila folder filled with redacted documents, commendation letters, and deployment records. But instead of the routine questions I expected, she leaned back in her chair and gave me a look that immediately put me on edge. "Sergeant Vasquez," she began, her voice carrying the tone of someone who had already made up her mind, "I have to say, your record is quite remarkable for someone so young." I should have heard the warning in those words, but at 26, I was naive enough to think she was paying me a compliment. "Thank you, ma'am. I've been fortunate to serve in some challenging assignments." She picked up a document from my file, scanning it with theatrical interest. "Yes, I can see that. According to this, you were deployed to Afghanistan for 14 months with the 75th Ranger Regiment's Intelligence Support Unit." "Yes, ma'am, that's correct." "And then immediately reassigned to a classified joint task force operating out of Germany." "I can confirm that I was stationed in Germany, yes, ma'am. The specifics of that assignment are classified above my current clearance level to discuss." That's when her expression changed. The polite professionalism disappeared, replaced by something that looked almost like amusement. "Sergeant, I've been doing this for 15 years. I've seen every kind of fabrication you can imagine. War heroes who never left the States, combat medics who spent their deployment filing paperwork, intelligence analysts who think watching movies about spies qualifies as field experience." I felt my stomach drop. "Ma'am, I'm not sure what you're implying." "I'm not implying anything," she said, setting down the document with deliberate care. "I'm stating a fact. Your record shows you transitioning between assignments that would require years of specialized training, completing missions that would typically be reserved for officers with decades of experience, and earning commendations from units that don't officially exist. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle in the room. Either you're the most remarkable soldier in the history of the United States Army, or you're one of the most creative liars I've ever encountered. The accusation hit me like a physical blow. Dr. Morse, every document in that file has been verified through proper channels. My commanding officers can attest to my service record. Your commanding officers, she repeated, consulting another document. Like Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Chen, who supposedly supervised your work in Afghanistan? Yes, ma'am. The same Lieutenant Colonel Chen who died in a helicopter crash 2 years ago? The room seemed to tilt. Ma'am, I was not aware that Colonel Chen had passed away. That's devastating news. How convenient, Dr. Morse said coldly. And Major Roberts, who signed off on your German assignment? What about Major Roberts? He's been stationed in South Korea for the past 3 years. According to his records, he's never set foot in Germany. I felt like I was drowning. Every piece of evidence she presented seemed to contradict my lived experience, but I knew what I had done, where I had been, who I had served with. The problem was that the nature of my assignments made verification nearly impossible through normal channels. Dr. Morse, I understand how this might look, but I can explain these discrepancies if you'll allow me to contact my actual chain of command. Your actual chain of command? She laughed, but there was no humor in it. Sergeant, the chain of command you've described doesn't exist in any official capacity. The units you claim to have served with have no record of you. The missions you describe never happened, at least not according to any documentation I can find. I tried to maintain my composure, but panic was setting in. Ma'am, with respect, the nature of intelligence work means that many records are compartmentalized. Just because you can't access them doesn't mean they don't exist. Sergeant Vasquez, she said, her voice taking on a tone of mock sympathy, I have been cleared to access records at the highest levels of classification. If your service record was real, I would be able to verify it. That was the moment I realized I was trapped. The very secrecy that had protected my assignments was now being used as evidence against me. The operations I had participated in were so classified that even their existence was denied. The people I had worked with operated under covers so deep that their real identities were known only to a handful of individuals at the highest levels of government. I had spent years following orders that came through encrypted channels, working with teams whose faces I knew but whose real names I never learned, completing missions that would never appear in any official record. I had thought I was serving my country with honor and distinction. Instead, I had created a service record that looked like an elaborate fantasy. Dr. Morse, I'm requesting that you contact General Morrison at the Pentagon. He can verify my assignments. I've already spoken with General Morrison's office, she replied smoothly. They have no record of any Sergeant Elena Vasquez working on classified projects under their jurisdiction. It was then that I understood the full scope of my situation. Not only was my service record being questioned, but the very people who had given me my orders were now denying that those orders had ever been issued. I was being abandoned by the system I had served faithfully, left to face accusations that I couldn't refute without revealing information that would compromise ongoing operations. The hearing that followed was a nightmare that lasted 3 days. I sat at a metal table in a windowless room while a panel of officers questioned every aspect of my military career. They went through my records line by line, pointing out inconsistencies and gaps that I couldn't explain without violating my oath of secrecy. Colonel Henderson, who presided over the hearing, was a career officer with 30 years of service and a reputation for being fair but uncompromising. He had overseen dozens of these cases, weeding out the fraudsters and protecting the integrity of military service records. To him, I was just another case file, another soldier who had gotten caught trying to inflate her record. Sergeant Vasquez, he said on the final day of the hearing, this panel has reviewed all available evidence regarding your service record. We have found significant discrepancies between your claimed assignments and the official documentation available to us. I knew what was coming, but hearing the words still felt like a verdict of death. Furthermore, your inability to provide verifiable contact information for your supposed commanding officers, combined with the mysterious nature of your claimed assignments, suggests a pattern of deliberate deception. Major Williams, who sat to Colonel Henderson's right, shook his head with disgust. "Sergeant, I've served in intelligence myself. I know what real classified work looks like, and this ain't it. This is someone who watched too many spy movies and thought she could fool the system." The third panel member, Captain Rodriguez, was younger than the others and seemed genuinely uncomfortable with the proceedings. She had tried to ask questions that would give me a chance to explain myself, but every answer I gave only made things worse. How could I explain that my commanding officers operated under assumed names? How could I describe missions that officially never happened? "Sergeant Vasquez," Colonel Henderson continued, "based on the evidence presented to this panel, we find that you have deliberately falsified your military service record. You are hereby stripped of all security clearances and will be processed for administrative separation from the United States Army." The words echoed in the sterile room like a death sentence. 8 years of my life, 8 years of dedication and sacrifice, reduced to a finding of fraud and deception. "Furthermore," he added, "these findings will be entered into your permanent record and shared with relevant agencies to prevent any future attempts to use false military credentials for personal gain." As the gavel came down, ending the hearing, I felt something break inside me. Not just my heart, but my faith in the system I had believed in so completely. I had given everything to serve my country, and in return, my country had branded me a liar and thrown me away. The walk from the hearing room to the base exit was the longest of my life. Word had already spread about the outcome, and I could feel the stares and whispers following me. Some soldiers looked at me with disgust, as if my presence was contaminating their honor. Others just looked uncomfortable, unsure how to react to someone who had been revealed as a fraud. My few possessions were packed into a single duffel bag, and my military ID was unceremoniously cut in half by the security guard at the gate. As I walked through those gates for the last time, I felt like I was leaving behind not just my career, but my entire identity. The civilian world was harsh and unforgiving for someone with my complicated history. The discharge papers I carried told a story of fraud and deception, making it impossible to get work in any field related to security or defense. Even jobs that had nothing to do with the military seemed hesitant to hire someone whose integrity had been officially questioned. I ended up working at a small accounting firm in downtown Dallas, processing invoices and filing paperwork for 40 hours a week. It was honest work, but it felt like exile. Every day, I would put on business clothes and pretend to be a normal civilian employee, while inside, I was still the soldier who had risked her life for missions that apparently never happened. My supervisor, Janet Crawford, was a kind woman in her 50s who had hired me despite my complicated background. She never asked too many questions about my time in the Army, sensing that it was a painful subject. For 8 months, I filed her papers and answered her phones, trying to build a new life from the ashes of the old one. But late at night, alone in my small apartment, I would take out the few mementos I had managed to keep from my military service. A challenge coin from a unit that officially didn't exist, a photograph of me and my team after a successful mission that never made it into any report, a letter of commendation signed by someone whose name had been redacted so thoroughly that only the signature remained. These items were the only proof I had that my service had been real, but they were also evidence that could land me in federal prison if anyone discovered them. The information they contained was still classified at the highest levels, and possessing them as a civilian was a serious crime. During those long, dark months, I began to piece together what had happened to me. Through careful research and discreet inquiries, I learned that Dr. Morse had built her reputation by exposing military fraudsters, but she had also made mistakes. Several soldiers whose records she had questioned had later been vindicated when their classified assignments were finally acknowledged. The problem was that her vindication process could take years, and in the meantime, the soldiers she had wrongly accused had their lives destroyed. Some had committed suicide rather than live with the shame of being branded fraudsters. Others had simply disappeared, unable to cope with the transition to civilian life after having their military identity stripped away. I also learned that the units I had served with were part of a larger reorganization that had occurred after my discharge. Operations that had been conducted under one classification level were being reclassified and reassigned to different commands. In the bureaucratic chaos that followed, records were being transferred, archived, or in some cases, deliberately destroyed to protect ongoing operations. The people I had worked with had likely been reassigned or given new cover identities. The missions I had participated in were being scrubbed from official records as part of a larger effort to distance the military from certain controversial operations. I hadn't been abandoned out of malice, but rather caught in the bureaucratic equivalent of friendly fire. But knowing the reason for my situation didn't make it any easier to bear. I was still branded as a fraud, still unable to prove my service, still exiled from the life I had built in the military. I had become a ghost, someone who had served her country faithfully, but whose service had been erased from history. It was during this dark period that I received an unexpected phone call that would change everything. The number was blocked, and the voice on the other end was electronically distorted, but the words were clear enough. "Sergeant Vasquez, my name is not important, but my message is, your country needs you again." I nearly hung up, assuming it was some kind of prank or scam. "I think you have the wrong number. I'm not a sergeant anymore." Elena Maria Vasquez, service number 123-123-456-789, formerly assigned to classified Joint Task Force operations in Afghanistan and Germany. You specialized in signals intelligence and human asset management. Your last assignment was designated Operation Nightfall, which successfully identified and neutralized a terrorist cell planning attacks on NATO facilities. The level of detail was impossible for anyone outside of my former chain of command to know. Operation Nightfall had been so classified that even its code name was known only to a handful of people. "Who is this?" I whispered. "Someone who knows the truth about your service record, and someone who needs your specific expertise for a matter of national security." The voice explained that there had been a catastrophic security breach at one of the military's most sensitive facilities. Foreign agents had infiltrated the network and were systematically downloading classified information that could compromise ongoing operations around the world. The breach involves the same type of human asset networks that you specialized in during your classified assignments. We have reason to believe that someone with intimate knowledge of our operations is feeding information to hostile forces. I felt my heart racing. This was exactly the kind of work I had trained for, the kind of mission that had defined my military career. But I was also acutely aware of my current status. I don't have a security clearance anymore. I can't even get a job as a mall security guard, let alone work on classified operations. "Your clearance was suspended, not revoked," the voice corrected, and the suspension was based on paperwork discrepancies, not any actual security concerns. The people who make the real decisions about national security know exactly who you are and what you've done for this country. There was a long pause before the voice continued. "Sergeant, in 72 hours, there will be a briefing for the Secretary of Defense about this security breach. The people responsible for your discharge will be in that room, along with the contractor who questioned your record. We want you to be the one to deliver that briefing." The audacity of the proposal took my breath away. "You want me to brief the Secretary of Defense after everything that's happened?" "We want you to do the job you were trained to do, and we want the people who wronged you to see exactly what they threw away when they decided you were expendable." The caller gave me an address and a time, then hung up without another word. I sat in my kitchen for hours afterward, staring at the piece of paper where I had written down the information. Part of me was terrified that this was some kind of elaborate setup, a test to see if I would violate my oath by discussing classified information. But another part of me, the part that had never stopped being a soldier, knew that this was my chance for redemption. The building I was directed to looked like any other office complex in the Virginia suburbs, but the security protocols made it clear that this was anything but ordinary. I was subjected to multiple screenings, background checks, and interviews before being escorted to a secure floor that required 3 different access cards to reach. The team I was introduced to consisted of intelligence professionals from various agencies, all working on different aspects of the security breach. They treated me with the professional respect that I hadn't experienced since my discharge, and it became clear that they had done their homework on my background. "Sergeant Vasquez," said the team leader, a woman who introduced herself only as Agent Parker, "we've reviewed your actual service record, not the sanitized version that was available to the Discharge Review Board. Your work on human asset networks is exactly what we need for this investigation." Over the next 48 hours, I threw myself into the work with an intensity that surprised even me. The breach was more sophisticated than initially thought, involving not just computer intrusion, but also human intelligence assets who had been systematically compromised. The patterns I identified matched techniques I had encountered during my classified deployments, suggesting that the same hostile intelligence service was responsible. Working with classified information again felt like coming home after a long exile. My mind, which had been dulled by months of routine civilian work, came alive as I analyzed intercepts, tracked communication patterns, and built a comprehensive picture of the breach. The breakthrough came 36 hours into the investigation. While reviewing archived communications from one of my former operations, I noticed a reference that shouldn't have been there. It was a code phrase that had been used in a completely different operation, in a different country, with different assets. Someone with access to multiple classified programs had cross-contaminated the intelligence. "Agent Parker," I called out, my voice trembling with excitement, "I need you to look at this." What I had discovered was evidence of a mole who had been operating for years, someone with access to the highest levels of classified information, who had been feeding details to foreign intelligence services. The mole had been careful to make each individual breach seem unconnected, but when viewed through the lens of my specialized experience, a clear pattern emerged. "Agent Parker," I called out, my voice trembling with excitement, "I need you to look at this." What I had discovered was evidence of a mole who had been operating for years, someone with access to the highest levels of classified information, who had been feeding details to foreign intelligence services. The mole had been careful to make each individual breach seem unconnected, but when viewed through the lens of my specialized experience, a clear pattern emerged.
"Jesus Christ," Agent Parker muttered as she reviewed my analysis. "How did we miss this?" "Because you were looking at each incident individually," I explained, "but I worked on several of these operations. I know which information was compartmentalized and which assets were supposed to be isolated from each other. Someone has been connecting dots that should never have been connected." The investigation that followed moved with lightning speed. Within hours, we had identified the source of the breach, Dr. Patricia Morse, the same contractor who had questioned my military service record 8 months earlier. She had used her position reviewing military records to identify soldiers who had worked on classified operations, then systematically targeted their files to extract operational details. The evidence was overwhelming. For 3 years, Dr. Morse had been selling classified information to foreign intelligence services, using her security clearance and her reputation for exposing fraud as cover for her own criminal activity. She had questioned my record not because she suspected fraud, but because she wanted access to information about the operations I had participated in. My discharge had been a cover-up, a way to discredit me before I could realize what she was doing and expose her activities. The inconsistencies she had found in my record weren't evidence of fraud, but rather proof of the compartmentalized security measures that had prevented her from accessing certain operational details. "Sergeant," Agent Parker said as we prepared for the final briefing, "there's something you need to know. The Secretary of Defense specifically requested that you deliver this briefing personally. He wants the people responsible for your discharge to hear directly from you about what they enabled when they decided you were a fraud." The morning of the briefing, I put on my dress uniform for the first time in 8 months. It felt strange and familiar at the same time, like wearing the clothes of someone I used to be. The ribbons and badges told the story of my service, each one representing months or years of dedication that had been dismissed as fabrication. As I walked into the Pentagon's most secure briefing facility, I could feel the weight of history pressing down on me. This was where the most important decisions about national security were made, where generals and admirals planned the operations that shaped the world. And today, I would be standing at the front of the room, telling them about a betrayal that had nearly compromised everything they had worked to protect. The Secretary of Defense, the Honorable James Harrison, was a former Marine general with a reputation for being both brilliant and ruthless. He had personally requested this briefing after learning about the scope of the security breach and the circumstances of my discharge. As the room filled with senior officials, I could see the familiar faces of my tormentors. Colonel Henderson sat in the third row, looking uncomfortable and confused. Major Williams was beside him, his usual confidence replaced by obvious nervousness. And in the front row, Dr. Patricia Morse sat with her hands folded in her lap, trying to maintain her composure despite knowing that her world was about to collapse. Secretary Harrison called the room to attention and gave a brief introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, we are here today to receive a briefing on Operation Guardian Shield, the investigation into one of the most serious security breaches in recent memory. The briefing will be delivered by Sergeant First Class Elena Vasquez, whose expertise and dedication made this investigation possible. As I walked to the podium, I could hear the sharp intake of breath from Colonel Henderson. The idea that the soldier he had discharged for fraud was now briefing the Secretary of Defense was clearly beyond his comprehension. Mr. Secretary, distinguished colleagues, I began, my voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment. 8 months ago, I was discharged from the United States Army for allegedly falsifying my military service record. Today, I stand before you to report that the person responsible for that discharge has been exposed as a foreign intelligence asset who used her position to compromise our most sensitive operations. The room was absolutely silent as I laid out the evidence. I explained how Dr. Morse had systematically targeted soldiers with classified assignments, how she had used her access to security reviews to extract operational intelligence, and how she had sold that information to hostile foreign governments. The irregularities in my service record that Dr. Morse cited as evidence of fraud were actually proof of the compartmentalized security measures that she was trying to circumvent. When she couldn't access the information she needed through normal channels, she orchestrated my discharge to discredit me as a potential witness to her activities. I could see Dr. Morse shrinking further into her seat with each revelation. The woman who had destroyed my career with such confidence and authority now looked like nothing more than a common criminal caught in the act. Mr. Secretary, I continued, the investigation has recovered evidence that Dr. Morse sold classified information that directly led to the compromise of 3 ongoing operations and the deaths of 2 intelligence assets. Her activities represent one of the most serious security breaches in recent history. Secretary Harrison's face was grim as he absorbed the implications. Sergeant, what is your assessment of the total damage caused by this breach? Sir, the damage is extensive but containable. Dr. Morse's access was limited to historical records and personnel files. She did not have access to current operational details or future planning. However, the information she did compromise will require us to reassess and potentially restructure several ongoing programs. As I concluded my briefing, Secretary Harrison stood and addressed the room. Ladies and gentlemen, what we have heard today represents both a serious failure and a remarkable success. The failure was in allowing a foreign asset to operate within our security review system for 3 years. The success was in the dedicated work of professionals like Sergeant Vasquez, who identified and neutralized this threat. He turned to face me directly. Sergeant, on behalf of the United States of America, I want to apologize for the injustice you suffered. Your service record will be fully restored, and you will receive the recognition and compensation that you deserve for your years of classified service. But it was his next words that truly vindicated me. Furthermore, I am immediately reinstating your security clearance and offering you a position with the Defense Intelligence Agency where your specialized expertise will be properly valued and protected. The aftermath was swift and decisive. Dr. Morse was arrested as she tried to leave the building, charged with espionage and treason. The evidence against her was overwhelming, and she eventually pleaded guilty to avoid the death penalty, receiving instead a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Colonel Henderson requested a private meeting with me after the briefing. The man who had presided over my discharge looked aged and beaten as he sat across from me in a small conference room. "Sergeant," he said, his voice heavy with regret, "I owe you an apology that I can never adequately express. I failed in my duty to protect a good soldier, and I enabled a traitor to continue her activities. I take full responsibility for my role in this injustice." I could see the genuine remorse in his eyes, and despite everything he had put me through, I felt no satisfaction in his suffering. "Colonel, you made decisions based on the information available to you. Dr. Morse was very good at her job." "That's generous of you to say, but it doesn't excuse what happened. I should have looked deeper, asked harder questions, demanded better verification. Instead, I took the easy path and branded you a fraud." Major Williams never apologized directly, but I heard through mutual contacts that he had requested a transfer to a remote posting in Alaska, unable to face the shame of his role in my discharge. Captain Rodriguez, the youngest member of the panel, wrote me a letter expressing her regret and asking for advice on how to better handle such cases in the future. The restoration of my service record was more than just a bureaucratic correction. It was a validation of everything I had sacrificed for my country, acknowledgement that my service had been real and valuable. The classified commendations that had been sealed away were finally added to my official file, painting a picture of a soldier who had gone above and beyond in service to her nation. But perhaps more importantly, the experience had taught me something about resilience and truth. For 8 months, I had lived with the weight of being branded a fraud, knowing that the truth was too classified to reveal. I had been forced to rebuild my identity from nothing, to find worth in myself that didn't depend on external validation. When the truth finally came out, when my service was finally acknowledged, I realized that my value as a person had never actually depended on what others thought of me. I had always been the soldier who had risked her life for her country, regardless of whether anyone else knew it or believed it. My new position with the Defense Intelligence Agency allowed me to use my specialized skills in ways that my previous assignments never had. I was no longer just following orders or executing plans made by others. I was helping to shape policy and strategy at the highest levels of government. The work was challenging and rewarding, but it was also deeply personal. Every case I worked on, every threat I helped to neutralize, was a reminder of why I had chosen to serve in the first place. It wasn't for recognition or glory, but for the simple belief that some things are worth fighting for, even when that fight requires sacrifices that no one will ever know about. The story of my discharge and vindication eventually became a cautionary tale within military and intelligence circles, a reminder of the importance of protecting those who serve in the shadows. New protocols were established for reviewing classified service records, and additional safeguards were put in place to prevent foreign assets from infiltrating the security review process. Dr. Morse's betrayal had been devastating, but it had also revealed weaknesses in the system that could now be addressed. In a strange way, her crimes had made the country more secure by forcing a comprehensive review of security procedures and personnel vetting processes. As I settled into my new role, I often thought about the other soldiers who might be suffering the same fate I had endured. How many dedicated service members were being branded as frauds because their real service was too classified to acknowledge? How many careers were being destroyed by bureaucratic failures, or worse, by enemy action designed to discredit our best people? I made it my mission to identify and help these forgotten soldiers, to ensure that their service was properly recognized and that they received the support they deserved. It became a personal crusade, driven by my own experience of abandonment and redemption. The work was often frustrating and sometimes heartbreaking. Some soldiers had been damaged too severely by their experiences to ever fully recover. Others had given up hope entirely, disappearing into civilian life and never seeking the vindication they deserved. But for every success, for every career restored, and every service member vindicated,
I felt a deep sense of satisfaction that went beyond professional accomplishment. Standing in that Pentagon briefing room, watching Dr. Morse's face as her crimes were exposed, I had felt many emotions: anger at the injustice I had suffered, relief that the truth was finally known, satisfaction that my tormentor was facing consequences for her actions. But the emotion I remember most clearly was gratitude. Gratitude for the experience that had taught me who I really was beneath the uniform and the rank. Gratitude for the opportunity to serve my country in a new and more meaningful way. And gratitude for the reminder that truth, no matter how long it takes to emerge, has a power that no lie can ultimately defeat. The young woman who had been escorted from the base 8 months earlier had been broken by injustice and betrayal. The woman who walked out of that Pentagon briefing room was stronger, wiser, and more determined than ever to protect the values and the people she had sworn to defend. My mother always told me that the truth has a way of coming out, no matter how deeply it's buried. I had never believed her more than I did in that moment, watching the people who had wronged me finally understand the magnitude of their mistake. Sometimes the greatest victory isn't in proving your enemies wrong, but in showing them exactly what they lost when they chose not to believe in you. The first challenge in my new position at the Defense Intelligence Agency came sooner than I expected. 3 weeks after my Pentagon briefing, I was called into a secure conference room where Agent Parker was waiting with a stack of files that looked disturbingly familiar. "Elena," she said, using my first name for the first time since we'd worked together, "we have a problem. The Morse investigation opened up a can of worms that we're still trying to understand." She spread the files across the table, each one marked with the distinctive red stripe that indicated a compromised personnel record. These are 12 soldiers whose records were reviewed by Morse over the past 3 years. All of them were discharged for various reasons related to questions about their service history. My stomach tightened as I realized what she was implying. "You think they're all like me, legitimate soldiers who were targeted?" We think Morse wasn't just stealing information. We think she was systematically destroying the careers of soldiers who might have been able to expose her activities. Agent Parker's expression was grim. The pattern is too consistent to be coincidental. Every single one of these soldiers had worked on classified operations that would have given them insight into the kind of information Morse was after. I picked up the first file, reading the name on the tab: Staff Sergeant Michael Chen. The summary inside was heartbreakingly familiar. Questioned service record, inconsistent documentation, inability to verify classified assignments, administrative discharge for fraudulent enlistment.
The same playbook that had been used against me. How many of them are still alive? I asked, dreading the answer. 9, Parker replied quietly. 2 committed suicide within 6 months of their discharge. 1 died in a car accident that we're now investigating as potentially suspicious. The weight of those deaths settled on my shoulders like a physical burden. While I had been struggling to rebuild my life in civilian exile, other soldiers had been facing the same nightmare without hope of vindication. Some of them hadn't been strong enough to survive it. "I want to contact them," I said immediately. "I want to tell them what we've discovered and help them get their records restored." Parker nodded, but her expression remained troubled. "That's exactly what we were hoping you'd say. But Elena, you need to understand that this is going to be more complicated than just clearing their names. Some of these soldiers have been living with this injustice for years. They've built new lives, new identities. Having their military service acknowledged might not be the simple victory you might expect." She was right, of course. Not everyone would want to relive the trauma of their discharge, even if it meant official vindication. But I also knew that I couldn't live with myself if I didn't at least try to reach out to them. The first soldier I contacted was Staff Sergeant Michael Chen, whose file I had read first. According to the information Parker had given me, he was living in Portland, Oregon, working as a night security guard at a warehouse complex. The phone number in his file was 3 years old, but I managed to track down a current address through public records. I debated calling versus showing up in person, ultimately deciding that a face-to-face conversation would be more likely to convince him that I was legitimate. Too many discharged veterans had been targeted by scammers, promising to restore their benefits or upgrade their discharge status for a fee. The warehouse where Michael worked was in an industrial section of Portland that looked like it had seen better days.
I waited in my rental car until his shift ended at 6 in the morning, then approached him as he walked to his beat-up Honda Civic in the parking lot. "Staff Sergeant Chen?" I called out, using his former rank deliberately. He turned around, and I could see the instant wariness in his eyes. Michael was a small man, probably no more than 5'6", but he carried himself with the alert posture of someone who had learned not to trust unexpected encounters. "Nobody's called me that in 4 years," he said carefully. "Who's asking?" "My name is Elena Vasquez. I'm with the Defense Intelligence Agency, and I have information about your discharge that I think you need to hear." His laugh was bitter and tired. "Lady, I've heard every con in the book. Whatever you're selling, I'm not buying." I had anticipated this reaction and come prepared. I pulled out a copy of his original service record, the classified version that showed his real assignments and commendations. His eyes widened as he recognized documents he hadn't seen since his discharge. "How did you get these?" he whispered. "Because the person who destroyed your career has been exposed as a foreign intelligence asset. Patricia Morse was selling classified information to enemy governments, and she targeted soldiers like you to prevent them from discovering her activities." Michael's face went through a series of emotions: confusion, disbelief, hope, and finally a kind of exhausted relief. He leaned against his car, suddenly looking much older than his 28 years. "4 years," he said quietly. "4 years I've been living with everyone thinking I was a fraud. My own family stopped talking to me. My fiancé left me because she couldn't handle the shame of being engaged to someone who lied about his military service." The pain in his voice was raw and immediate, and I felt a surge of anger at what Morse's betrayal had cost this man. "Michael, your service was real. Your sacrifices were real, and we're going to make sure everyone knows it." But even as I said the words, I could see the skepticism in his eyes. "What does that actually mean? Are you going to call my ex-fiancée and tell her I wasn't lying? Are you going to explain to my parents why they disowned their son based on false accusations? Some things can't be fixed, even with the truth." His response haunted me as I flew back to Virginia. I had been so focused on the idea of vindication, on clearing these soldiers' names, that I hadn't fully considered the deeper damage that had been done. Lives had been shattered, relationships destroyed, families torn apart. Even if we restored their service records, we couldn't undo years of pain and isolation. The second soldier on my list was Technical Sergeant Maria Santos, who had been living in Phoenix since her discharge 2 years earlier. According to our files, she had been working as a freelance translator, using the language skills she had developed during her military service, but unable to get security clearance for the kind of high-level work she was qualified for. Maria was more receptive to my initial contact, perhaps because her discharge was more recent and the wounds were still fresh enough that vindication felt meaningful. We met at a coffee shop near her apartment, and I could see immediately that she was struggling financially. Her clothes were clean but worn, and she ordered only a small coffee despite clearly being hungry. "I've been following your story," she said before I could even introduce myself properly. "When the news broke about Morse being arrested, I wondered if there were others like you." "There are," I confirmed. "At least 9 that we know of, possibly more."
We're working to restore everyone's records and provide compensation for the injustice you've suffered." Maria's eyes filled with tears, but she quickly wiped them away. "Do you know what the hardest part has been? Not the financial struggle, not even the damaged reputation. It's been the doubt. Even knowing that I served honorably, even knowing that my discharge was based on lies, there was still this voice in my head asking, what if they were right? What if I somehow misremembered or exaggerated my service?" I understood exactly what she meant. During my own months of exile, I had found myself questioning my own memories, wondering if the stress and trauma had somehow distorted my recollection of events. The human mind wasn't designed to cope with having its most fundamental truths systematically invalidated. "The doubt is the cruelest part," I agreed, "because it makes you complicit in your own destruction. But Maria, your service was real. I've seen the classified reports you filed, the commendations you earned. You saved lives with your work." Over the following weeks, I contacted 6 more of the soldiers on Parker's list. Each conversation was different, but the underlying themes were consistent:
Years of shame, damaged relationships, financial struggles, and a profound sense of betrayal by the system they had served faithfully. Staff Sergeant David Kim had become a mechanic in his hometown in Ohio, working on civilian cars instead of the advanced military vehicles he had specialized in. He was grateful for the vindication, but worried about the impact on his teenage children, who had grown up thinking their father was a fraud. Corporal Jennifer Walsh had moved to rural Montana and was working as a ranch hand, as far from her former life in military intelligence as she could get. She was hesitant even to discuss restoration of her service record, fearing that any attention would disrupt the fragile peace she had built in isolation. Senior Airman Robert Taylor had struggled with alcoholism since his discharge, losing jobs and relationships as he tried to numb the pain of his destroyed reputation. He was in rehab when I contacted him, and while he was grateful for the news about Morse, he was also realistic about how much the vindication could actually help him rebuild his life. The most difficult conversation was with Sergeant First Class Lisa Murphy, who had been discharged 3 years earlier and was now working as a substitute teacher while fighting a custody battle with her ex-husband. Her former spouse was using her fraudulent discharge as evidence that she was an unfit mother, claiming that someone who would lie about military service couldn't be trusted with children. "Even if you clear my record," Lisa said during our phone conversation, "the damage is already done. My ex-husband's lawyer will just argue that the whole vindication is some kind of cover-up or that I somehow manipulated the system. The doubt has been planted, and you can't unplant it." Each of these conversations reinforced my growing understanding that vindication, while important, was only the beginning of what these soldiers needed. They required comprehensive support, legal assistance, financial compensation, counseling services, and help rebuilding the relationships and careers that had been destroyed by false accusations. I brought these concerns to Agent Parker and her superiors at the DIA, arguing for a comprehensive rehabilitation program that would go beyond simply restoring service records. These soldiers didn't just lose their military careers, I explained during a briefing with senior officials. They lost their identities, their support systems, their financial security. We have a moral obligation to help them rebuild what was destroyed. The response was mixed. Some officials were supportive, recognizing that the government had failed in its duty to protect these soldiers and owed them significant compensation. Others were more concerned about the potential legal and financial liability of acknowledging the scope of the damage that had been done. "Sergeant Vasquez," said Deputy Director Thompson, a career intelligence officer who had been skeptical of the rehabilitation program from the beginning, "while we all sympathize with what these soldiers have endured, we have to be realistic about what the government can and should do. We can restore their service records and provide some financial compensation, but we can't rebuild their personal relationships or guarantee them new careers." "With respect, sir," I replied, "we're not talking about normal career transitions or typical personal setbacks. These soldiers were deliberately targeted by a foreign intelligence asset who used our own security review system as a weapon against them. The government enabled this attack by failing to properly vet Dr. Morse and by not having adequate safeguards in place to protect soldiers with classified service records." The debate continued for several more meetings, but eventually a compromise was reached. The Defense Department would establish a special fund to provide financial compensation to the affected soldiers, along with legal assistance for those facing ongoing challenges related to their fraudulent discharges. Additionally, the military would create new protocols for reviewing complex service records and would assign advocate officers to help soldiers navigate the security review process. It wasn't everything I hoped for, but it was a significant step forward. More importantly, it established the principle that the government had a responsibility to protect soldiers who served in classified capacities, even when that service couldn't be publicly acknowledged. As I worked on implementing these new programs, I also found myself drawn into a different kind of challenge. The Morse investigation had revealed that foreign intelligence services were actively targeting U.S. military personnel, using sophisticated techniques to identify and exploit vulnerabilities in our security systems. "Alina," Agent Parker said during one of our regular briefings, "we've identified at least 3 other contractors who had similar access to military personnel records. We need to conduct a comprehensive review to determine if any of them might be following Morse's playbook."
The prospect of finding more traitors within our security review system was both exciting and terrifying. On one hand, it offered the possibility of preventing future injustices like the one suffered by me and the other targeted soldiers. On the other hand, it suggested that the problem was much larger and more systematic than we had initially realized. The investigation expanded rapidly, involving multiple agencies and hundreds of personnel files. My role was to analyze the patterns of questionable discharges and identify cases that might represent deliberate targeting rather than legitimate security concerns. It was painstaking work, requiring me to review thousands of pages of personnel records and discharge documentation. Each file represented a human life, a career that had been ended or damaged by official action. Most of the discharges were legitimate, the result of genuine security concerns or administrative violations. But scattered throughout the records were cases that raised red flags. Soldiers with exemplary service records who had been discharged based on minor discrepancies. Veterans whose classified assignments made verification difficult. Personnel who had worked on sensitive projects that foreign intelligence services would have been interested in. 3 months into the expanded investigation, we identified another potential traitor, Dr. Kenneth Walsh, a civilian contractor who had been conducting security reviews for the Air Force. Like Morse, Walsh had built a reputation as a thorough investigator who was skilled at identifying fraudulent claims. But when we examined his cases more closely, a disturbing pattern emerged. Walsh had recommended the discharge or denial of security clearances for 17 Air Force personnel over the past 4 years. All 17 had worked on classified aerospace projects involving advanced aircraft development or satellite technology. All 17 had been discharged or reassigned based on what appeared to be minor documentation discrepancies or questionable associations. "This is definitely not a coincidence," I told Agent Parker as we reviewed Walsh's cases. "He's targeting specific types of personnel just like Morse did, but he's focusing on aerospace and satellite technology instead of human intelligence operations." The evidence against Walsh was less conclusive than what we had found against Morse, largely because he had been more careful about covering his tracks.
But there were enough suspicious patterns to justify a thorough investigation, including surveillance and financial monitoring. The surveillance revealed that Walsh was indeed passing information to foreign contacts, but his methods were more sophisticated than Morse's had been. Instead of directly selling classified documents, he was providing targeting information that allowed foreign intelligence services to recruit or compromise personnel who had access to sensitive projects. "Walsh isn't just stealing information," explained Agent Martinez, the FBI counterintelligence specialist who was leading the surveillance operation. "He's enabling foreign intelligence services to build their own networks within our aerospace programs. The long-term damage from this kind of operation could be catastrophic." The complexity of Walsh's activities meant that building a case against him would take months, possibly years. In the meantime, we had to balance the need to gather evidence with the urgency of protecting current personnel who might be at risk. I found myself working increasingly long hours, analyzing patterns and building profiles of potential targets. The work was intellectually challenging, but it was also emotionally draining. Each case I reviewed represented another life that had been damaged or destroyed by foreign intelligence operations, targeting the very people who had dedicated themselves to protecting national security. The stress began to affect my personal life in ways I hadn't anticipated. I had moved into a small apartment near DIA headquarters, thinking that the proximity to work would be convenient. Instead, it made it difficult to separate my professional and personal lives. I found myself bringing files home, working late into the night, and waking up thinking about cases and patterns. My social life, which had never been particularly robust, practically disappeared. The few friendships I had maintained during my civilian exile were strained by my inability to discuss my work or explain my sudden return to government service. Dating was virtually impossible, both because of my work schedule and because of the security restrictions that limited what I could share about my life. The isolation was familiar from my time in the classified world, but it felt different now. During my original military service, the secrecy had been shared with my teammates and colleagues. We were all operating under the same constraints, dealing with the same challenges. Now, I was often the only person in a room who understood the full scope of what we were dealing with, carrying knowledge that I couldn't share even with my closest colleagues.
Dr. Sarah Chen, the staff psychologist who conducted mandatory wellness checks for DIA personnel, picked up on my growing isolation during one of our quarterly sessions. "Elena," she said, reviewing her notes from our previous meetings, "you've mentioned several times that you're having trouble connecting with people outside of work. Can you tell me more about that?" I tried to explain the challenge of building relationships when so much of my life was classified, but Dr. Chen pressed deeper. "It sounds like you're using classification as a shield," she observed. "Yes, there are legitimate restrictions on what you can discuss, but there are also plenty of aspects of your life that you could share if you chose to. What do you think is really keeping you isolated?" Her question forced me to examine my own behavior more honestly. The truth was that I had become comfortable with isolation during my months of civilian exile. When everyone around you believes you're a fraud, you learn to rely only on yourself. When your most fundamental truths are denied by the system you trusted, you stop trusting anyone else's version of reality. "I think I'm afraid," I finally admitted. "During my discharge, I learned that everything I believed about loyalty and trust could be taken away in an instant. Even now, knowing that I've been vindicated, there's this part of me that it all disappear again." Dr. Chen nodded understanding. "That's a normal response to trauma, Elena. You experienced a profound betrayal by institutions and people you trusted. It's natural that you would develop protective mechanisms to prevent that from happening again." Our sessions became more frequent and more focused on helping me rebuild my ability to trust and connect with others. It was slow work, complicated by the demands of my job and the ongoing stress of the Walsh investigation. Meanwhile, the rehabilitation program for Morse's victims was beginning to show results. Michael Chen had been able to get his record officially restored and was working with military advocates to help him transition into a better career. Maria Santos had received financial compensation that allowed her to pursue additional education and certification in high-level translation work. David Kim was slowly rebuilding his relationship with his children, who were old enough now to understand that their father had been wrongly accused. Not all the outcomes were positive. Robert Taylor had completed his rehabilitation program, but was struggling to find stable employment, partly because of his criminal record from alcohol-related incidents during his post-discharge period. Jennifer Walsh had declined most of the assistance offered, preferring to maintain her privacy and distance from anything related to the military. Lisa Murphy had achieved a significant victory in her custody battle, with the court ruling that her restored service record and the circumstances of her original discharge constituted evidence of good character rather than deception. But the legal process had been emotionally exhausting, and she was still working to rebuild her relationship with children who had spent years believing their mother was a liar. Each of these stories reinforced my understanding that justice and healing were separate processes. We could restore records, provide compensation, and acknowledge wrongdoing, but we couldn't undo years of trauma and reconstruction. The soldiers who had been targeted by Morse would carry the scars of that experience for the rest of their lives, regardless of any official vindication. 6 months into the Walsh investigation, we finally had enough evidence to move forward with arrests. Unlike Morse, who had operated largely alone, Walsh had been working with a network of foreign intelligence assets and corrupted American citizens. The operation to round up the entire network required coordination between multiple agencies and careful timing to prevent any members from escaping or destroying evidence. I was not directly involved in the arrests, but I was part of the team that analyzed the evidence seized during the raids. What we found was sobering. Walsh and his network had been operating for at least 6 years, compromising dozens of military and civilian personnel who worked on classified aerospace projects. "The scope of this is unprecedented," Agent Parker told me as we reviewed the preliminary analysis. "Walsh wasn't just targeting individuals for discharge like Morse did. He was building a comprehensive map of our aerospace programs, identifying key personnel, and providing foreign intelligence services with detailed information about how to penetrate our most sensitive projects." The evidence showed that Walsh's activities had contributed to several significant intelligence losses, including the compromise of satellite technology that had been shared with foreign adversaries and the recruitment of military contractors who had provided information about advanced aircraft programs. "How many careers were destroyed?" I asked, knowing that this was only one part of the larger picture, but feeling a personal connection to the individual victims. "We're still counting," Parker replied grimly. At least 23 military personnel were discharged or had their clearances revoked based on Walsh's recommendations, but there are probably others whose careers were damaged in more subtle ways, who were passed over for promotions or assignments because of questions he raised about their reliability. The process of identifying and contacting Walsh's victims would be even more complex than what we had done with Morse's cases. The time frame was longer, the number of affected personnel was larger, and the damage to classified programs meant that some cases might never be fully resolved due to ongoing security concerns.
I volunteered to lead the victim identification and rehabilitation effort, drawing on my experience with the Morse cases. But I also knew that this would be a years-long project that would require resources and commitment far beyond what had been provided for the original program. Elena, Deputy Director Thompson, said during a briefing about the expanded rehabilitation effort, "I want you to understand the magnitude of what you're proposing. We're talking about potentially hundreds of affected personnel, legal proceedings that could drag on for years, and compensation costs that could reach into the tens of millions of dollars." "Sir," I replied, "we're also talking about preserving the integrity of our security review system and maintaining the trust of military personnel who serve in classified capacities. If we don't adequately address this situation, we risk creating a culture where our best people are afraid to serve in sensitive positions because they know they could be targeted for elimination by foreign intelligence services." The argument was compelling, but I could see the resistance in the faces around the conference table. Government agencies were not designed to acknowledge mistakes on this scale, and the political implications of admitting that foreign intelligence services had successfully operated within our security apparatus for years were staggering. Ultimately, a compromise was reached that provided some resources for victim rehabilitation while limiting the government's acknowledgement of institutional failure. It was frustrating, but it was also realistic given the political and bureaucratic constraints we were operating under. As I worked on implementing the expanded rehabilitation program, I also found myself becoming something of an expert on counterintelligence vulnerabilities within military personnel systems. I was invited to speak at conferences, contribute to policy reviews, and advise on security improvements designed to prevent future cases like Morse and Walsh. The work was professionally rewarding, but it also kept me connected to the trauma and damage that had brought me to this point. Every day, I was reminded of how easily the system could be manipulated to destroy innocent people, and how many lives had been damaged by our failures to protect those who served in the shadows. During one particularly difficult week, when I was reviewing case files that included 2 more veteran suicides connected to fraudulent discharge proceedings, I found myself questioning whether the emotional cost of this work was sustainable. Dr. Chen had been helping me work through my own trauma, but she had also warned me about the dangers of taking on too much responsibility for others' pain. "Elena," she said during one of our sessions, "you can't save everyone, and you can't undo all the damage that's been done. At some point, you have to find a way to live with the knowledge that injustice exists while still maintaining your own emotional health." Her words were wise, but they were also difficult to accept. The soldier in me wanted to fight every battle, to pursue every lead, to ensure that no one else would suffer the way I had suffered. But the human being in me was growing exhausted from carrying the weight of so much pain and anger. The breakthrough came unexpectedly during a conversation with Michael Chen about his progress in rebuilding his life. We had developed a friendship during the rehabilitation process, bonded by our shared experience of wrongful discharge and vindication. "You know what the strangest part has been?" he said during one of our regular check-in calls. "It's not the vindication that feels most important anymore. It's knowing that what happened to us led to changes that will protect other people. The new security review protocols, the advocate program, the counterintelligence improvements, that stuff matters more than my individual case." His perspective helped me understand something important about my own experience. The personal vindication had been crucial for my own healing, but the real value of what we had endured was in the institutional changes it had prompted. Our suffering hadn't been meaningless if it prevented others from experiencing the same injustice. This realization didn't eliminate the sadness and anger I felt about the cases I couldn't solve and the people I couldn't help, but it did provide a framework for understanding how individual trauma could contribute to collective progress. Every case we documented, every victim we helped, every policy we improved was part of a larger effort to strengthen the system that protects all military personnel.
The Walsh investigation continued to expand, revealing connections to other cases and other contractors. It became clear that foreign intelligence services had been systematically targeting military personnel review systems for at least a decade, using a variety of methods to identify and eliminate individuals who posed threats to their operations. The scope of the problem was daunting, but it was also clarifying. This wasn't just about individual cases of injustice or isolated security failures. It was about a comprehensive attack on the foundations of military personnel security, designed to weaken our ability to protect classified information and conduct sensitive operations. Understanding the magnitude of the threat helped me put my own experience in perspective. I hadn't been targeted because of anything I had done wrong or any personal failing on my part. I had been targeted because I was good at my job, because I posed a threat to foreign intelligence operations, because my skills and knowledge made me dangerous to America's enemies. In a strange way, this realization was both humbling and empowering. Humbling because it reminded me that I was just one soldier among many who had been caught in this larger conflict. Empowering because it confirmed that my service had been valuable enough to make me a target for elimination. As the first year of my work at DIA drew to a close, I found myself reflecting on how much had changed since that morning when I walked out of the Pentagon briefing room with my vindication complete. I had expected that moment to be the end of my story, the resolution that would allow me to move on with my life. Instead, it had been the beginning of a new chapter, one that was more complex and challenging than anything I had experienced during my original military service. The work was harder, the stakes were higher, and the emotional toll was more severe. But it was also more meaningful, because it was work that I had chosen rather than work that had been assigned to me. I was no longer the young soldier who had joined the Army to serve her country in whatever capacity was needed. I was now someone who understood the system's vulnerabilities and was committed to protecting others from the kind of injustice I had experienced. It was a different kind of service, but it was service nonetheless. The phone call from Michael Chen came on a Friday evening as I was preparing to leave the office. I could hear the excitement in his voice before he even explained why he was calling. "Elena, you're not going to believe this. I just got a job offer from Boeing. They want me to work on the same kind of advanced systems I specialized in during my military service. The security clearance investigation is going to take months, but they're willing to wait because they know my record has been fully restored." The joy in his voice was infectious, and I found myself smiling for the first time in weeks. "Michael, that's incredible news. You deserve this opportunity." "I wanted to thank you," he continued, "not just for the vindication, but for showing me that it was possible to fight back. For months after my discharge, I felt like I was completely powerless, like the system was just too big to challenge. Watching you stand up to it, watching you demand accountability, that gave me hope that things could actually change." After we hung up, I sat in my office for a long time, looking out at the Virginia countryside through my small window. Michael's success was a reminder that the work we were doing had real impact on real people. It wasn't just about institutional change or policy improvements, though those things were important. It was about giving people back their dignity, their sense of purpose, their ability to contribute to something larger than themselves. The road ahead was still long and uncertain.
There would be more cases to investigate, more victims to help, more systems to reform. There would be setbacks and frustrations, political obstacles, and bureaucratic resistance. There would be people I couldn't save and injustices I couldn't correct. But there would also be moments like this one, when a good soldier got a second chance to serve his country, when the truth finally emerged from beneath layers of deception and betrayal, when the system proved that it could learn from its mistakes and protect those who had sworn to protect it. As I finally gathered my things and prepared to leave the office, I thought about the young woman who had walked into that reception hall 8 months ago, anxious and isolated, convinced that she was a problem to be managed. That woman had been broken by injustice, but had found the strength to rebuild herself. She had learned that truth, no matter how long buried, has a power that no lie can ultimately defeat. The woman walking out of this office was different, stronger, more purposeful. She had work to do, people to help, a system to improve. She had found her calling not in the original service that had been taken from her, but in the fight to ensure that such injustice never happened again.
The truth had set her free, but more importantly, it had given her the tools to set others free as well. And in that mission, she had found not just vindication, but redemption. 2 years had passed since Michael Chen's call about his job at Boeing, and the rehabilitation program had evolved into something far beyond what I had originally envisioned. What started as an effort to help 9 wrongfully discharged soldiers had grown into a comprehensive counterintelligence initiative that was reshaping how the military protected personnel with classified assignments. The success stories were mounting. Maria Santos had not only found stable work as a high-level translator, but had also been recruited by the State Department for diplomatic assignments that utilized her unique combination of language skills and cultural knowledge. David Kim had reconciled with his children and was now working as a civilian contractor on the same advanced vehicle systems he had specialized in during his military service. But it was Lisa Murphy's transformation that affected me most deeply. After winning her custody battle, she had enrolled in law school with the goal of specializing in military justice and veterans' rights. She called me regularly to discuss cases she was studying, approaching each one with the passion of someone who understood firsthand how the system could fail those it was meant to protect. "Alina," she said during one of our conversations, "I've been thinking about something. What if we created a legal clinic specifically for veterans dealing with discharge issues? Not just the cases like ours, involving foreign intelligence, but all the soldiers who get caught in bureaucratic nightmares and don't have advocates to help them fight back." The idea was ambitious and would require resources we didn't currently have, but it planted a seed that would eventually grow into something significant. Lisa's legal education was giving her insights into systemic problems that went far beyond the specific cases we had been working on. Meanwhile, the Walsh investigation had revealed an even more disturbing truth. The network of compromised contractors and foreign intelligence assets had been operating across multiple agencies, not just within military personnel systems. The Department of Energy, the CIA, the NSA, and several major defense contractors had all been penetrated to some degree. Agent Parker had been promoted to lead a joint task force dedicated to rooting out the entire network, and she had asked me to serve as her deputy. The role would mean leaving my position at DIA and taking on responsibilities that went far beyond military personnel issues, but it also represented an opportunity to attack the problem at its source. "Alina," Parker explained during our initial briefing about the expanded mission, "what we've discovered is that foreign intelligence services have been conducting a systematic campaign to identify and eliminate the most effective American intelligence personnel. They're not just stealing information, they're degrading our human intelligence capabilities by removing our best people from the field." The scope of the operation was staggering. Over the past decade, at least 47 intelligence professionals had been discharged, transferred, or had their careers derailed based on information provided by compromised contractors. Some had been targeted for fabricated security violations, others for alleged financial improprieties or personal conduct issues. In each case, the accusations had been subtle enough to seem legitimate, while effectively removing dangerous individuals from sensitive positions. The genius of it, I observed as we reviewed the patterns, is that they used our own security paranoia against us. Every intelligence agency is terrified of insider threats, so when someone raises questions about an employee's reliability, the natural tendency is to err on the side of caution and remove the potential problem. Parker nodded grimly. And once someone's been flagged as a security risk, even if the allegations are later disproven, their career is effectively over. No agency wants to take the risk of hiring someone who's been investigated for potential disloyalty. My new role required me to work closely with counterintelligence specialists from across the government, sharing information and coordinating investigations in ways that cross traditional agency boundaries. It was fascinating work, but it also exposed me to the full extent of how foreign intelligence services had penetrated American security systems. The most disturbing discovery came 6 months into the Joint Task Force operation. While reviewing financial records from one of the compromised contractors, we found evidence of payments that had been disguised as consulting fees, but were actually funding a much larger network of assets within the federal government. Dr. Amanda Foster, a contractor who had been conducting background investigations for the FBI, had been receiving regular payments from a shell company that traced back to Russian intelligence services. Unlike Morse and Walsh, who had focused on specific types of personnel, Foster had been casting a much wider net, targeting anyone whose work might be valuable to foreign intelligence services.
Foster's been operating for 8 years, Agent Martinez told me as we reviewed her case files. She's had access to background investigations for thousands of federal employees, including personnel from every major intelligence agency. The potential compromise is enormous. The investigation into Foster's activities required a delicate balance between gathering evidence and protecting ongoing operations. Many of the people she had investigated were still in sensitive positions, and we couldn't simply assume that everyone she had flagged was innocent without conducting our own review. I found myself working 18-hour days, analyzing case files and looking for patterns that might indicate which investigations had been legitimate and which had been designed to eliminate threats to foreign intelligence operations. It was exhausting work, made more difficult by the knowledge that every delay potentially meant more damage to national security. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Jennifer Walsh, the former soldier who had chosen isolation over rehabilitation, contacted me directly with information that proved crucial to the Foster investigation. "Alina," she said during our first phone conversation in over a year, "I've been following the news about these compromised contractors, and I think I have information you need to hear." Jennifer had maintained her privacy since her record had been restored, declining most offers of assistance and avoiding any contact with government agencies. But she had also been conducting her own investigation into the circumstances of her discharge, driven by a need to understand what had happened to her. "After my discharge, I started keeping track of other soldiers who seemed to have similar experiences," she explained. "Not formally, just collecting news articles and social media posts from people who claimed they'd been wrongfully accused of misconduct or security violations." What Jennifer had discovered was a pattern of suspicious discharges and career derailments that went back more than a decade. She had identified over 100 cases where military or intelligence personnel had been removed from sensitive positions based on allegations that seemed designed to discredit them rather than address legitimate security concerns. "The thing is," Jennifer continued, "I cross-referenced these cases with public records of who conducted the investigations, and Foster's name comes up in about 30% of them. That's way too high to be coincidental." Jennifer's research provided the roadmap we needed to understand the full scope of Foster's activities. Working with her data, we were able to identify specific cases where Foster had likely fabricated or exaggerated security concerns in order to eliminate personnel who posed threats to foreign intelligence operations. The evidence was strong enough to justify Foster's arrest, but it also revealed the need for a much larger investigation into the personnel who had been targeted. Unlike the Morse and Walsh cases, where the victims had been primarily military personnel with classified assignments, Foster's targets included civilian intelligence analysts, State Department officers, and contractors working on a wide range of sensitive projects. "We're looking at potentially hundreds of affected personnel," Parker told me as we planned the expanded investigation. The logistical challenges were enormous, but they were overshadowed by the human cost of what we were discovering.
Foster's activities had been more sophisticated and longer-running than either Morse or Walsh, meaning that her victims had often been living with the consequences of false accusations for years or even decades. Some of the cases were heartbreaking. A CIA analyst who had been forced to retire early after Foster raised questions about his financial records, despite the fact that her investigation had been based on fabricated evidence. A State Department officer who had been denied promotions for 5 years because of unsubstantiated allegations about his personal relationships. A defense contractor who had lost his security clearance and his career based on accusations that Foster had manufactured to eliminate him as a threat to a penetration operation she was protecting. The rehabilitation process for Foster's victims required resources that far exceeded what had been allocated for the original program. More importantly, it required a fundamental shift in how the government approached cases of wrongful accusation within the intelligence community. I proposed the creation of a permanent office dedicated to investigating and remedying cases where personnel had been wrongfully targeted by foreign intelligence operations. The office would have the authority to conduct independent investigations, override agency decisions about personnel actions, and provide comprehensive rehabilitation services for affected individuals. "What you're proposing," Deputy Director Thompson told me during the budget presentation, "is essentially an ombudsman office for the intelligence community. That's a significant institutional change that would require buy-in from every major agency." Sir, I replied, what we've discovered is that foreign intelligence services have been systematically attacking our personnel systems for over a decade. They've been using our own security procedures against us, turning our caution into a weapon for eliminating our most effective people. We need an institutional response that's proportional to the threat. The proposal faced significant resistance from agency leadership, who were concerned about external oversight of their personnel decisions. But the scale of the compromise, combined with congressional pressure following news reports about the contractor investigations, eventually forced a compromise. The Office of Personnel Security Review was established as an independent entity within the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, with authority to investigate cases where foreign intelligence activity might have influenced personnel decisions. I was offered the position of Deputy Director, which would give me the resources and authority to implement the kind of comprehensive program that the victims deserved. Accepting the position meant another career transition, but it also represented the culmination of everything I had been working toward since my own vindication. The office would have the power to investigate historical cases, prevent future targeting, and provide meaningful assistance to personnel who had been wrongfully affected. Lisa Murphy was among the first people I called after accepting the position. She had just completed her first year of law school and was already working on veterans' rights cases through a clinical program. "Elena," she said, "this is exactly what we've been talking about, a systematic approach to protecting people who serve in sensitive positions. I want to be part of this when I finish law school." The conversation reminded me of how much had changed since I first reached out to Morse's victims. What had started as an effort to help a small group of wrongfully discharged soldiers had evolved into a comprehensive program for protecting intelligence personnel from foreign targeting operations. Michael Chen had become something of an unofficial spokesman for the rehabilitation program, speaking at conferences and training sessions about his experience with wrongful discharge and successful reintegration. His technical expertise had made him valuable to Boeing, but his personal story had made him an advocate for other veterans facing similar challenges. "The thing people don't understand," he told me during one of our regular calls, "is that the vindication isn't just about clearing your name. It's about getting your identity back. For 4 years, I believed that everything I had accomplished in the military was meaningless because other people said it didn't happen. Having that restored doesn't just fix your record, it fixes your sense of self." His insight captured something important about the psychological impact of wrongful accusation, particularly for people whose identities were closely tied to their service. The damage went far beyond career consequences or financial losses. It attacked the fundamental sense of purpose and meaning that had driven these individuals to serve in the first place. As I prepared to transition to my new role, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this point. 3 years earlier, I had been a discharged soldier working at an accounting firm, branded as a fraud and abandoned by the system I had served faithfully. The path from that low point to heading an office dedicated to protecting intelligence personnel had been neither straight nor easy. The personal cost had been significant. My relationship with Dr. Chen had helped me work through much of the trauma from my discharge, but I still struggled with trust and intimacy. The demands of the rehabilitation program had consumed most of my time and energy, leaving little room for the kind of personal relationships that might have provided balance and perspective. But I had also found a sense of purpose that went beyond anything I had experienced during my original military service. The work was challenging and meaningful in ways that conventional assignments could never be. Every case we resolved, every career we restored, every policy we improved represented a victory against the forces that had tried to destroy not just my life, but the lives of hundreds of dedicated public servants. The ribbon-cutting ceremony for the Office of Personnel Security Review was a small affair, attended primarily by senior officials and representatives from the various agencies we would be working with. But for me, it represented the institutionalization of principles that had been forged through personal struggle and sacrifice. Secretary Harrison, who had overseen my original vindication, was among the speakers at the ceremony. 3 years ago, he said, we learned that foreign intelligence services had successfully penetrated our personnel security systems, using them as weapons against our own people. Today, we are establishing an office that will ensure such attacks never succeed again. His words were gratifying, but they also reminded me of the responsibility that came with the new position. The office would be judged not just on its ability to resolve historical cases, but on its success in preventing future targeting operations and protecting personal personnel from similar attacks. The first major case that came to our attention involved a Navy intelligence officer who had been placed under investigation after a contractor raised questions about his overseas travel patterns. The investigation had been ongoing for 8 months, during which the officer had been suspended from duty and subjected to extensive surveillance and questioning. Lieutenant Commander Harrison's travel to Eastern Europe coincides with known intelligence gathering opportunities, the contractor's report stated. His pattern of movement suggests possible contact with foreign intelligence services. But when our office reviewed the case, a different picture emerged. Harrison had been conducting legitimate intelligence operations in Eastern Europe, working with allied services to gather information about Russian military activities. The contractor who had raised questions about his travel had likely been trying to identify and compromise personnel involved in operations that were damaging to Russian intelligence interests. This is exactly the kind of case the office was created to handle, I told Agent Parker during our review of the Harrison investigation. Someone is using our security review process to identify and neutralize personnel who are conducting successful operations against foreign intelligence services. The resolution of Harrison's case required delicate coordination with multiple agencies and careful attention to protecting ongoing operations. But we were able to demonstrate that the allegations against him had been fabricated, and he was returned to duty with his record cleared and his career intact. More importantly, the case allowed us to identify another compromised contractor and begin the process of investigating the personnel decisions he had influenced over the past several years. The pattern was becoming depressingly familiar. Foreign intelligence services had systematically infiltrated the contractor network that conducted security reviews for federal agencies, using them to eliminate American personnel who posed threats to their operations. 6 months into the new office's operations, we had identified 12 compromised contractors and were investigating over 300 cases where personnel decisions might have been influenced by foreign intelligence operations. The scale of the penetration was larger than anyone had initially realized, but the systematic approach we were taking was beginning to show results. Maria Santos joined our staff as a senior analyst, bringing her language skills and cultural knowledge to investigations involving foreign intelligence services. Her experience as a victim of wrongful targeting gave her unique insights into the psychological profiles of personnel who were likely to be targeted and the methods used to discredit them. What strikes me, she said during one of our case review meetings, is how sophisticated the targeting has become. They're not just looking for people with access to classified information, they're identifying individuals whose specific expertise makes them dangerous to foreign intelligence operations. Her observation led to the development of new protection protocols for personnel whose specialized skills made them likely targets for elimination. The protocols included enhanced security measures, regular monitoring for signs of targeting, and expedited investigation procedures for cases where foreign intelligence involvement was suspected.
The work was professionally rewarding, but it also kept me connected to the ongoing reality of how foreign intelligence services operated against American personnel. Every case we handled was a reminder that there were people actively working to identify and eliminate individuals like me, using the very systems we trusted to protect us as weapons against us. The psychological toll of this knowledge was something I had to constantly manage. Dr. Chen continued to work with me on strategies for maintaining emotional balance while dealing with such adversarial realities, but it remained a challenge that required constant attention. Elena, she said during one of our sessions, you've built your identity around protecting others from the kind of injustice you experienced. That's admirable, but it's also potentially limiting. What happens to your sense of purpose if you solve this problem? What defines you beyond your role as an advocate and protector? Her questions forced me to consider aspects of my identity that I had neglected while focusing on the mission of institutional reform. The work had become so central to my sense of self that I had difficulty imagining life beyond it, which was potentially problematic for long-term psychological health. The breakthrough came during a conversation with Jennifer Walsh, who had gradually become more engaged with the rehabilitation program despite her initial reluctance to participate.
She had agreed to serve as an advisor to our office, providing insights based on her unique perspective as someone who had chosen isolation over traditional rehabilitation. The thing that helped me the most, she told me during one of our consultations, wasn't getting my record restored or receiving compensation. It was realizing that what happened to me was part of something larger, something that affected a lot of people. Once I understood that, I stopped taking it personally. Her insight helped me understand something important about my own healing process. The personal vindication had been crucial, but the real transformation had come from understanding that my experience was part of a larger pattern of attack against American security personnel. Fighting that larger battle had given meaning to the individual suffering, but it had also allowed me to move beyond the personal trauma to focus on systemic solutions. 2 years after the establishment of the Office of Personnel Security Review, we published our first comprehensive report on foreign intelligence targeting. The document, heavily redacted for public release, outlined the scope of the penetration operations and the measures being taken to prevent future attacks. The report's findings were sobering. Over the previous decade, foreign intelligence services had successfully influenced personnel decisions affecting at least 400 federal employees and contractors. The targeting had been systematic and sophisticated, focusing primarily on individuals whose work posed threats to foreign intelligence operations or who had access to particularly sensitive information. But the report also documented significant progress in addressing the problem. The rehabilitation program had successfully restored the careers of over 200 wrongfully targeted individuals. New security protocols had been implemented across all major agencies. The contractor vetting process had been completely restructured to prevent future penetration operations. Perhaps most importantly, the institutional culture had begun to change. Agency leadership was now aware of the foreign intelligence threat to personnel systems and was taking proactive steps to protect their people from targeting operations. Lisa Murphy graduated from law school that spring and immediately joined our office as a staff attorney. Her first assignment was to lead the development of legal standards for investigating cases of suspected foreign intelligence targeting, bringing her first-hand experience as a victim to the technical challenges of building legal cases against sophisticated adversaries. What we're doing, she told me during her first week on the job, is creating a new area of law. There's no real precedent for systematically investigating and remedying cases where foreign intelligence operations have influenced domestic personnel decisions. Her legal expertise complemented the investigative and analytical capabilities that our office had already developed, allowing us to build stronger cases and provide more comprehensive remediation for affected personnel. The 5th anniversary of my original discharge passed quietly, marked only by a brief reflection on how much had changed since that day when I walked out of the military installation branded as a fraud. The woman who had been destroyed by false accusations had been rebuilt into someone stronger and more purposeful, but she had also learned that personal vindication was only the beginning of a much larger fight. The office had become a model for other governments dealing with similar foreign intelligence threats to their personnel systems. Delegations from allied nations regularly visited to learn about our methods and adapt them to their own security challenges. The work we had pioneered in response to a series of individual injustices had evolved into a comprehensive approach to protecting intelligence personnel from systematic targeting operations. But for me, the most meaningful measure of success remained the individual cases. Every career restored, every reputation rehabilitated, every family reunited represented a victory against the forces that had tried to destroy not just my life, but the lives of hundreds of dedicated public servants. Michael Chen called on the anniversary of his first contact with Boeing to tell me that he had been promoted to lead engineer on a classified project that would have been impossible if his discharge had remained on his record. Maria Santos had been selected for a diplomatic assignment in Eastern Europe, using her language skills and cultural knowledge to support American interests in a region where such expertise was desperately needed. David Kim had reconciled completely with his children and was now coaching his daughter's soccer team, having found the work-life balance that had been impossible during his period of disgrace and financial struggle. Lisa Murphy had won her first case as a staff attorney, successfully arguing that a Navy petty officer had been wrongfully discharged based on fabricated evidence provided by a compromised contractor. Each of these victories was personal, but they were also institutional. The system that had failed these individuals had learned from its mistakes and had implemented changes designed to prevent similar failures in the future. The foreign intelligence services that had successfully penetrated American personnel systems were now facing a much more sophisticated and coordinated response to their targeting operations. As I prepared for another day of case reviews and policy meetings, I reflected on the journey that had brought me from personal destruction to institutional leadership. The path had been neither straight nor easy, marked by setbacks and frustrations as well as victories and vindications. But it had also been transformative in ways that I never could have anticipated when I first walked into that Pentagon briefing room to deliver my vindication. The personal trauma had become the foundation for institutional reform. The individual injustice had revealed systemic vulnerabilities that needed to be addressed. The foreign intelligence attack against one soldier had exposed a comprehensive campaign against American security personnel. Fighting that larger battle had given meaning to the individual suffering, but it had also allowed me to move beyond the personal trauma to focus on systemic solutions. 2 years after the establishment of the Office of Personnel Security Review, we published our first comprehensive report on foreign intelligence targeting of American personnel. The document, heavily redacted for public release, outlined the scope of the penetration operations and the measures being taken to prevent future attacks. The report's findings were sobering. Over the previous decade, foreign intelligence services had successfully influenced personnel decisions affecting at least 400 federal employees and contractors. The targeting had been systematic and sophisticated, focusing primarily on individuals whose work posed threats to foreign intelligence operations or who had access to particularly sensitive information. But the report also documented significant progress in addressing the problem. The rehabilitation program had successfully restored the careers of over 200 wrongfully targeted individuals. New security protocols had been implemented across all major agencies. The contractor vetting process had been completely restructured to prevent future penetration operations. Perhaps most importantly, the institutional culture had begun to change. Agency leadership was now aware of the foreign intelligence threat to personnel systems and was taking proactive steps to protect their people from targeting operations. Lisa Murphy graduated from law school that spring and immediately joined our office as a staff attorney. Her first assignment was to lead the development of legal standards for investigating cases of suspected foreign intelligence targeting, bringing her first-hand experience as a victim to the technical challenges of building legal cases against sophisticated adversaries. What we're doing, she told me during her first week on the job, is creating a new area of law. There's no real precedent for systematically investigating and remedying cases where foreign intelligence operations have influenced domestic personnel decisions. Her legal expertise complemented the investigative and analytical capabilities that our office had already developed, allowing us to build stronger cases and provide more comprehensive remediation for affected personnel. The 5th anniversary of my original discharge passed quietly, marked only by a brief reflection on how much it changed since that day when I walked out of the military installation branded as a fraud. The woman who had been destroyed by false accusations had been rebuilt into someone stronger and more purposeful, but she had also learned that personal vindication was only the beginning of a much larger fight. The office had become a model for other governments dealing with similar foreign intelligence threats to their personnel systems. Delegations from allied nations regularly visited to learn about our methods and adapt them to their own security challenges. The work we had pioneered in response to a series of individual injustices had evolved into a comprehensive approach to protecting intelligence personnel from systematic targeting operations. But for me, the most meaningful measure of success remained the individual cases. Every career restored, every reputation rehabilitated, every family reunited represented a victory against the forces that had tried to destroy not just my life, but the lives of hundreds of dedicated public servants.